So he's better. Being aware. Still in, almost done. I'm going to my last. This is anything still like 3 months on? Yeah, 4 months. Yeah. So is it just for the summer, or is it like one of the semesters? Yeah, it's for the summer. It's year round. Yeah. You remember Caleb? It sounds really cool. He's a senior, yeah. Yeah. I used to not much to do with him. He wasn't. Yeah, I talked to. Yeah, like I think there were 2 people from my team. Different no, he wasn't. He was a big fan. Tell me, it was the actual summer. That's what it was. We were on the roll. You heard about it? Did you ever want to get started? That's it. Thanks for coming out this evening. It's like an awesome day out. There's about 45, 50 people who actually signed up, and I was like, oh, okay, it's going to be a good turnout. I was beat up by the weather. Yeah. And there's like the kickoff with Argentina and
They went into extra time and.
So what? You ruined it for me. Yeah, we're recording the maybe lying. This will be a great event tonight. I'll try to be quick because we'll be able to enjoy the nice day. Today we have Wes LeBlanc from Gensler Analytics. Talking about some of the cool stuff that they've been doing. And I think the next meeting, which will hopefully be the end of August or end of July, beginning of August, will be on the Open City apps that was worked with some people that had collaborated with John Tolba, who was a previous presenter. So they did a good presentation of both data visualization and big data that's going on in the actual applications. So, cool. Thank you. Appreciate you guys having me, and thanks for coming. I see some folks in here, so this might be a little boring for some of you. You've probably seen it before. But, so my name is Wes LeBlanc. My background is actually, I'll try not to do that, but my background is actually in economics and finance. I started at Gensler about 2.5 years ago before I was at AECOM. Before that, I was at a company called ERA. Economics Research Associates, which was actually founded by Walt Disney, who was original team part of feasibility and financing and construction. And kind of over the next 50 years, grew into a boutique advisory firm specializing in market and financial analysis for kind of oddball concepts, right? So standard office buildings and things like that, those can kind of solve themselves, but unique concepts really require a very different type of analysis. So came over here. Started a team. We're about, right now, we're 5 people who have more of an economic quantitative background. My team, the more expanded team in Chicago, is probably about 13 or 15, depending on who you count, and then another 10 or so people across the firm. So one of the things, every company has a different definition of analytics and what it means for their core business. A lot of analytics that I see in the built environment actually is more design-oriented than it is kind of integrating different, from my perspective, than it is integrating different silos
disciplines, and that's really not what we're doing. This is, nice broad umbrella definition for us. Our focus is use of structured data and information. These are kind of 4 building blocks that we use. There are about 2 dozen. I think this gives you an idea. And calling it analytics instead of economics or something else, and the flexibility that allows us and types of people that we plug in. It's a nice broad umbrella for us to let a lot of different quantitative skill sets play together and bring projects to different places. So that's kind of essentially how we define it. When I step back and think about our industry and the built environment, I always try and organize through frameworks. Looking at it, this is something that seems to work for me and my team at least right now. It's kind of on this scale. I start thinking about the questions that we're trying to answer. In the end, that should be the organizing principle around everything we do in the project, right? And you start thinking about place. Those are questions like, what's the market demand? Who's the target market? Capitalization stack. Optimizing a ground plane. That's kind of on one extreme. And the other extreme has a lot more to do with buildings themselves and interiors, product function, space efficiency, sound traction, retention, things like that. And so if you start to think about some of the project types that fall, there are a lot more that are on here along that spectrum. So over here you find a place conversation, urban mixed use, master planning, TOD. On the other end of the spectrum, it's a lot of this corporate interiors. You find building architecture and performance. It's not just people performance, it's building performance as well. And then some interesting combinations in the middle that I actually really enjoy: urban infill, corporate campuses and headquarters, things like that require you to be fluent in both a people conversation and performance conversation, and a place conversation because you're big enough to be impacted by the surroundings that you sit in. And so, I find this useful. Obviously, there are a lot of different questions, and one of the things that I really like. I've got, I'm going to go through just a few frameworks, talk about a few ideas for things that maybe we could be doing better in our industry, give you a couple of project, for instances. But I'd really like to get ideas on what are some other questions we can answer better, or what are different ways that we can define computational approaches in the built environment, and particularly to include other disciplines is something that's really interesting to me. So along that range, I think, again, there's a bias as an economist in a design and architecture firm. There's a bias towards when you get a really interesting project, you got to go out and do a lot of primary research. That's generally not the case. There's actually a ridiculous amount of data and information that's out there if you know where it lives and how to get it and how to apply it and what it can answer for it. And so these are some of the sources that we use frequently. There are a lot of other sources, but we find these useful on a lot of different projects, and they're kind of bucketed a little bit towards that kind of spectrum of place to people. And so our focus is not developing data. It's more about how to actually develop process and go from really large amounts of information to answering questions, right, and really getting what those are. And so it's really about more intelligent solutions. And computation is part of that. So I'm just going to go through a couple of ideas of frameworks. This one, I don't really know the composition of everyone in the room, but this is a nice, simple one. This is the DIKW, the hierarchy of knowledge. It was established, as far as I can tell, the first time it really started was around the 1950s for organizational management. Essentially, companies that were starting to grow much larger in scale and had to have a lot more inputs into their decision-making processes needed a framework to start to make decisions. In the 70s and 80s, information science really started to develop much more. It's been adapted probably 20, 30, 40 times since. But it creates kind of a general framework that helps me at least understand where we can be really impactful in the project process. So first layer is data. These are tidbits, right? These are observations. It's meaningless in some way. And so, it's nice to have. You got to know what it is and what it can tell you. But more importantly, information is when you start applying structures, models, frameworks, that information, that data, right? And that starts to move you into a process where you can actually create decision models, which is what the knowledge hierarchy is now, defining different versions of the future, different future states that you can then get someone to choose between. And then hopefully it leaves wisdom, which is a good decision, acknowledging what is represented and what data and information and knowledge tells you, but also, as importantly, what it doesn't tell you, because we can't collect data on everything. And so, that's kind of the general structure where we play again in that process is here. So we understand the data in sets, but more often than not, we're focused on different types of structures, different highlight and answer decisions, right? Answer questions. There we go. And so that's what we do. We work across every project type, just about every type of process across the platform. Anything from gravity models to iterative financial processes, lifecycle costing, buildings, urban analysis, things like that. A lot of targeting decisions, looking at flexibility of mixed use, and a really ridiculously broad range of things that we work on, which is fun, but also kind of mind-numbing sometimes.
So as you go through a lot of those exercises, are those just things that you felt like doing at a certain point in time, or a client actually came to you and said, here are 5 to 7 sites that we're looking at developing. What's the
And by the way,
what's our potential profit for picking one versus the other?
And people feel free to jump in as well. Sorry. So it's both. Obviously, the ideal client for most of us is a client who walks in the door and says, I have a clue what I want to do. Can you help me? Those are really fun projects. So sometimes they have a very specific idea of what they're getting at. And that's what we can do is we can just really help give more robust analysis and strategy. Other times they don't know, in which case we kind of got to use all the tools. Okay. And then in other cases, it's increasingly, for us at least, it's just part of our process. It's a lens that we use to help make much better design decisions and align the design thesis with the business thesis, which is really kind of why my team is there. So one other thing that I think is, again, from someone who doesn't have an architecture or design background at all, I often feel that there's kind of a presupposed conflict between economics and design, right? That one is art, and then the other is just some kind of cold calculus. And actually, I don't think that exists. The best projects that I've ever worked on have actually done a very good job of applying the two. Because I think at the core, really good design at the core, really good economics is a very deep understanding of users, why people do things, how they react to different things. And really fundamentally, the best projects actually, the design thesis can stem from the business thesis, and the design thesis can impact the business thesis.
We work together.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, they're siloed 9 times out of 10 in the process. And part of that's just the industry composition and where architecture has been defined in the role of the built environment right now. But that's not where it should be. And so I actually think that some of the best innovation that we're likely to find in the industry is probably process innovation around that realm. That there's a lot of inefficiency, that there are much better ways of doing things than define their standard process. And that process innovation in our industry probably hasn't happened in a long time. It's not the same way. So,
you're sitting in what we like to call the center of modern architecture and enjoying what the Gensler does. A little contrary notion here. Design in modern Europe, and I'm talking about from the 1800s, particularly in Chicago and Germany, is a result of the economics. Just one building typology, and that's the high-rise building. Was driven by economics. You're not making new land all the time, and you're trying to come up with an efficient, cost-effective way for the building owner to get some rent. That's still a prevalent driver.
yeah. I'm not saying economics is a driver. Is that what you
No, I'm saying that design responds.
Oh, absolutely.
Design responds to
Yeah.
to the we have that tradition.
It's a dynamic process. And I think some of the things, maybe touch on these, maybe we can start to kind of dance around that a little bit. It's interesting. The reality of how things are typically financed and operated doesn't actually. We're starting to jump to my last. These are just like ideas of things that sometimes we work on, sometimes we don't work on as much. But types of questions or things that I feel like we could do better in our industry if we apply different tools and methodologies. One of them, so the last one, I think starts to touch on that maybe, which is this reality or this notion of how do we estimate the value or the potential flexibility that business models and financial models and the ways that things are developed. It's generally anywhere from a 10 to 20 year time horizon. And then there's the assumption of called the reversion value that at the end of that, somebody's going to magically pay me some sum of money that I can't really predict but a placeholder. And somebody gets left holding that a lot of times. And the reality is when we develop things, there are 50 to 100 year life cycle. And so there's a misalignment in the process between what the business thesis is and what the real life cycle is for a project. And you see variations of that in reuse, redevelopment. Something goes from office, it's now not suitable for office, and it moves towards residential and hotel. And so, the same square foot can have 3 different use methodologies. But I wonder whether or not we're really exploring what we could be in terms of changing what the business proposition is per square foot and how you actually design for higher flexibility. It seems to me that it's just not done very well. So a few things, some of these we work on. So targeting, I think was brought up, targeting location decisions, acquisition decisions, and ranking yank processes. If you can get someone to articulate a core, a few core elements of what their strategy is. I need this type of location, and you can, a lot of times you can folks do this. You can then develop generally a lot of data and information around that, which then opens up a lot of different models that you can apply to it to figure out what we're not making decisions. That type of process actually we do a fair amount of. It's something that is really important in retail. Retail's got some pretty well known tools around it. But generally, I feel like what drives that conversation more than anything else is cost per square foot or land value. There's only one piece of the value equation. Second, gravity models, you mentioned. So one of the things that walking Brent through this earlier.
I personally don't know what that is.
Yeah, it was like, so, just tell me if I'm speaking Greek, it's like most of this is. So, but gravity models, so a gravity model is something that's used in real estate market analysis a lot, oftentimes called a catchment area. Casinos do this a lot. Most casinos are based on a gravity model, a specific set of equations. Anytime you have geographic specificity, there's a time and distance and competition equation you can start to plug in that essentially tells you whether or not something's viable or how revenue their value can generate. And that's something that's usually applied at like a market-wide scale, like a city-wide scale. But I think it's something that we can apply. It's a very well-known set of equations. I think it's something that we can apply at much smaller neighborhood and district scales in urban areas, things other than casinos and retail, things like that, which is really where it's live. And so it's a tool that I think there's a broader application. Iterative design and financial analysis. So I'm going to have examples of a couple of these, but iterative design and financial analysis. This is one of those silo breaking down processes. You generally have a design process that starts, and then somebody does a market report, and there's a pro forma, and we're designing to that pro forma, and really we're not getting around some of the key issues or defining some of the key issues that are new generators of value or levers of value that we can create, or the critical issues. So like parking's always an issue. Sure. But it could be that if you're looking at a dormitory, it's really the core or something. You find surprising things when you really start to tinker with what design is and the true impact that it has on rate of return or present value of the project. Ground plane optimization, any urban project. A lot of times what you find, or at least what I see, is most of the value and visibility happens in the first floor or two. And it's especially pronounced when you start looking at high-value streets like Michigan Avenue or something like that, where you can, on the ground floor, you can maybe 10% of the square footage, but 80% of the value. And especially when you're building really big towers on top of that, those huge cores to start to go down, you're eating up a lot of very high-value space. And so really thinking through a process of how to get as much value at the first floor to, and sometimes 3 floors of the building, seems like something that we're constantly trying to answer, and sometimes well and sometimes not so well. The next, integrated real estate cost and performance. That's a variation of iterative design and financial analysis. Real estate cost and performance. What I'm thinking about here is more about corporate materials. In fact, we essentially have generally a financial advisor or broker-driven conversation around cost and sites and square footage costs. And then you have a workplace performance conversation, which is different. And they don't speak in the same language, and it's very hard for people to understand the overall impact of making one decision or another, because the models don't really exist to get that in the same place. So I'll have an example of that in a second. Portfolio prioritization. Anything where you have a lot of square footage or a large number of sites. The issue isn't whether or not you can do everything that might make sense, right? Because the reality is you're dealing with 5 million, 10 million square feet, 140 million square feet, whatever that number is. It's about choosing your spots and prioritizing where to get those spots. And that's an interesting process in terms of figuring out the different ways that you measure that. Right? Is it a performance issue? Is it a utility cost issue? What are the versions of the future that we're most worried about? We want to make sure we're all in that decision process.
So in situations like that, how are you presenting the information to the client? Is it just a spreadsheet, or
we try and go
look at
spreadsheets for people, so we try and go as far beyond that as we can into information graphics. But generally you start to like to do it as visually as we can. Usually, it's the basic graphics that help you understand criticality versus cost and things like that. Mm-hmm. And then you can take an entire portfolio and start to map it across that. And so you can figure out, depending on where they fall in that construct, which are the sets of buildings, or which are the types of square feet that you should focus on. So actually, we don't have an example of that here in the next slide, but we go to examples elsewhere. Mixed use value generation modeling. I don't really know what to call this. So kind of a step beyond ground plane optimization. And 2 things related to this. This would be an example of. So the first is your cost if you're talking about the same site, your cost to develop a square foot in one use versus another use, it'll change. But it won't change usually as dramatically as the value that you can actually get in that square foot. And so in an office versus hotel versus residential versus ground floor retail. And so figuring out those trade-offs in a building for what your true yield is for different types of square feet, including things like parking. Right? So yeah, a square foot of residential might yield you more than a square foot of retail. But if you factor in the reality that you're paying a lot more for parking on retail, then that may actually flip your equation on in terms of what you're emphasizing the site. And so that's one piece of it. The second piece is, so after you figure that out, and you figure out what the true kind of use values are that you're looking at in the product and things like that, you can then start to understand, okay, where do I create premium value? One of the things in real estate, so people in real estate sometimes step back and think about this a little bit when I say it, but I'm in real estate too. But real estate is actually a really crappy business model. It's very high cost, relatively low rate of return in terms of net income, 10%, something like that. It's not scalable. And so anything that you can do to generate a little bit more value based on the same fixed cost has a much larger impact on your actual net income and the return of the project. And so to the extent you can, and this is why branded product has much better return profiles because it doesn't really cost as much money to do square foot. It's all net. And so if you can start to figure out how to do the office in a way that you can squeeze premium value out of some set of use, or retail in such a way that you can sell more square footage that otherwise would have been a dead loss inside of a big building or something like that, it has a really big impact on the actual returns of the project. And when you go through this type of process, you can start to identify what those things are and start to kind of push that lever a little bit and see how you can augment the returns. And then the last, which we already talked about, height of flexibility. It seems like one way or another in the world, and maybe it will be in this generation next, we're going to end up with real estate models that are based on hyper flexibility. There just aren't enough resources in the world for us to build for everybody to get the same state of living. It's not the and so we're going to have to figure out ways that we can create things that can have many generations of use that we can't perceive right now. I have no idea what that design solution is. I trust the people in the room, the companies that works for to figure that out. But at some place we're going to have to get. So that's it. Couple of projects. Some of these are so kind of three just kind of for instances. And these are deliberately kept really small so that you can tell what the projects will say there. But it's just illustrative, right? This is iterative design information analysis. Actually, the reason why I'm at Gensler is I got a project, but I got coupled with Gensler when I was for the Tom working on a project, and we kind of stumbled into this as a methodology that it's created a lot of value. And then over the next few years, just but essentially, in this particular project, this is a water use project. It's got a little bit of everything. I think it's $400 million or so is the development cost. And we're starting to get into it, doing the planning, moving things around, fun stuff, right? We really kind of didn't have a thesis for what we were trying to do, or okay, why is this and this? Why is this product but this other product not over here, right? Or why are we not doing different types of work, or really things like that we just didn't have answers for. And so it's actually not very difficult to create. Wouldn't call it take it to the bank analysis. I call this pre-feasibility. But you can actually pretty easily develop a financial model that reflects some of the core design variables that we work on. And so that's what we did. This is actually several variations of these models. But so pretty quickly you can put it together. You got key financial drivers here. That's essentially your forma. And these are, you can in real time sit there and start to move things around on the site and couple things differently, and you can look at the actual return and values of what you're doing. And it's really helpful to, and I find particularly in an industry where a lot of us are kind of ground down in terms of time and what's allocated for fee and things like that. It's important to define down what you're looking at this way. Meaning not stay up here just developing ideas, but start to put parameters around. Okay, this is a realistic parameter that we should work with. This is a realistic parameter, and so it can really sharpen the And so in this one, what we ended up doing, we actually added some products, some things that weren't in prior use category actually. For some of the other products, one of the things that you would student housing, for example. We actually tweaked the products so that we had much lower loss factors that were better aligned with what that market was. The other thing that we did that's kind of interesting here, so there are certain types of things that want to be clustered together for deal structure. You see this, we'll be seeing this a lot more in Chicago. As we start moving from a repositioning process into the ground development process, it's really important how you can bundle things. And break them up into different deal structures. And that, it's usually not a question of whether or not there's demand. It's whether or not you're creating space that's digestible in a certain market horizon, right? And so what we ended up doing was creating 3 different investable products that could be developed in 3 different time periods. And so, it's it was a relatively quick, efficient process, and it kind of really brought us to new directions in terms of what we're focused on.
So when you're talking about loss factor, is that just a ratio of construction costs versus rentable?
Yes, rentable area versus circulation. Yeah, there was some product in there that really just, it was partly in the way that student housing product is stacked against residential rental product. That just didn't make sense.
So do you work hand in hand with the designer and come up with some
Absolutely.
different schemes? And then these are presentation pieces,
Yeah.
scenarios.
Yeah, and then, a lot of times what we do as well is use your regular work sessions. Because you can get somebody in the room and you can come out with decisions as opposed to kind of general directives. And also kind of crystallize. I know we talked about that, but here's what happens when you do that. And just kind of move the needle a little bit and show that we're doing that. Okay, integrated real estate costs and performance. Can't read this at all. Okay, so this particular project was a workplace project in a different country. And there were two things we were aiming to answer in this process, right? One is, who should we be targeting as tenants for the site? And then the second is, how do we actually communicate value to those tenants, right? And so what we try to do is bring together something that generally exists in the design world for workplace and the brokerage world, which is you can't really see it, but your actual costs over here in terms of rental rate, what kinds of densities you're looking at, your utility costs, things like that, right? Usually a set of equations that you're rolled out from whoever the financial advisor is, and it's just kind of a matter of fact, here are your options. And then on the other side, and some of this is proprietary research, but actually a lot of this is out there. It's known what the best practices in workplace performance can actually get into in terms of enhancements in productivity, how many people might participate in those enhancements, what the cost of attrition is, how you can actually change those variables and what that range is. It's actually reasonably well studied. And importantly, when you actually go to tenants, sometimes in HR they'll actually have variables. They would tell you what their actual cost of an employee loss is. And so what we did here was actually we just created a framework, a model. First it was an Excel, it was moving towards math. But a model that allows you to get all that stuff in the same conversation in the same place, so that people can look at their total cost pie, choosing one area of the city versus another, and then on top of that, choosing this type of workplace design to fit that. And so what this did was we were able to actually say, of all the areas of the city, really there were like 3 areas that should be looking at, but the tenants were going to have the highest value proposition here. That there were a couple of specific industries they should be looking at, and actually certain classes of buildings as well, which kind of hard to, that one was a little surprising to me, but essentially if you're already in best practices workplace building, even if you're in a different rent value area of the city, your value proposition moving to similar type building in another area just isn't the same, right? And so you're looking for tenants performance who are looking at those. And so you can sit there and actually run the iterations of which costs they're assigning where and what the aggregate cost is by making those decisions. And actually go develop the doing. You can actually go and sit down with them and hopefully get actual client variables that you can put in there and talk with them about how they might be able to change their cost.
Question.
Yep.
That's not really, let's say, equation, because you mentioned this is in another country.
Mm-hmm.
So there are cultural, historical variables that's going to create those calculus.
Yeah, but what you find in the workplace-specific conversation, you can see this would be a much bigger problem if you're talking about retail or something, which varies a lot more from country to country than workplace. When you look at workplace, actually, it's somewhat similar. If you look at studies in Germany, in the German office sector, or the UK office sector, compared to the North American sector, there are changes, but can still sensitize it. So we tried to make this as UK-centric as possible. But,
The greater variable in the middle of this chart.
yeah. So, mixed use value generation modeling. No idea what's called this, so good ideas. So we've got 3 different softwares we can do here. And actually, this is advanced sense. But essentially what we're trying to do is create kind of the economic rules. We're essentially trying to create a rules-based process to separate projects. And we're trying to do that both from the economic perspective as well as the design perspective. And so from economics, we understand roughly what the value is in net selling per square foot, different types of uses. Again, we were talking about before, how you can create premium value in some of those. Roughly what your order of magnitude areas would be for different types of uses. And so you can start to rough out some of the parameters that you're looking at. And then over here on the design side, you'll probably better speak to it, but we can start to define what are certain depths that are acceptable, what are certain heights that are acceptable, different types of things. It starts to tell you what a building should look like, right? And where things should go. And so, but by creating those parameters or rules on both sides of that, you can then start to mess with it and see how really changing the size of this starts to create big loss factors that really drive your performance. Or really pushing something silly numbers over here just by running up retail, ends up doing something that you're looking at 5th floor retail, which is, unless it's a mall, doesn't make any sense, right? And so it helps keep the 2 disciplines in check. So this is something that we've been doing, that we continue to do, that we're pushing as far as we can. So
Has something like this started to, I guess, affect maybe a designer that relies more on intuition than aesthetics, where you can start to say, oh, but like these moves that you're wanting to make actually make a really big, maybe negative economic impact or positive. I mean,
yeah, so like a triangle building or something. Right?
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Or twisting.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. It doesn't happen as much, I feel like, in our work. We work together, but again, to that notion of tension between economics and design, I really don't think that it exists. But I sometimes get that people, it's about how it looks. Yeah, it's about how it looks. It's also about how it works, how we finance it and improve it. Right? And so, there's sometimes that tension there, but if it's a collaborative process, right? And you get the right people to work with other disciplines, that actually ends up being much better. And that's really, that's our whole point of view, is that it's better to have these things as part of the process, as opposed to external forces impacting what we do. Let's take ownership of the things that we know our designs need to account for, and help put ourselves to a higher standard, but also push back on things that we think are really important for others.
So is this software for showing the client that in this case we're going to design value for the project? Or I'm not exactly clear on the value.
So this does a couple things for us, right? Yes, it quantifies for us which schemes over here generate more value, right? And from the design perspective, it starts to imply what that means for floor plates, for decks, for things like that, which can allow you to shape the building.
So the mixed use is already there.
Yeah, this one is presupposing mixed use.
The program was, we got to what the program should be by Wes's market studies, first of all, where it was like, who lives here, who shops here, who plays here, and that started to decide what makes sense, whether office makes sense, or and then we went from there. Advertised. So you added value to the client as you were able to push through some scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely.
But do you think that, I mean, the examples that you showed,
they're mostly like developer driven, which means, and you're saying that they're rule based, which tends to make it, you know what, that there's an end goal that you're trying to reach. You're trying to maximize X number of dollars. And does that allow for, or do you run into cases where you're saying, okay, this is, we're within 10% of the amount of money, but in these configurations, there's obviously way different trade-offs, or there's something that you have to negotiate, which starts to talk about a larger value.
Yeah.
The retail theory, but here, this is the trade-offs.
Yeah, this is, and so I take back some designers on that one. But it's a really good point, though, especially because, yes, these are largely developer examples. I have other examples that aren't developer examples, but in those processes, it's always important to note that whatever you decide to measure in the value of the process, right, whether or not you can quantify it exactly, right? And so if the urban gesture is something that's really important in a project, you have to figure out how to get that into whatever the set of things are that you're measuring. In this case, it's a financial measure. But, and that's why it's important to think about, my background's economics and finance, so most of my projects that I speak to have that bent. But when you think about the hierarchy of knowledge, it's important to note that the frameworks and things that you apply don't have to be financial. A lot of times you're not. And having that flexibility, that understanding of the different data that you can apply to produce that is important. But yeah, so if there are things like that that need to be accounted for, you got to figure out whatever your decision model is that has some measure of whether a data or a weighted average or something that actually counts for it.
I guess that's, is it like your weighted average? Like, I'm just wondering what are maybe some other things that you're trying to optimize for? Is it always dollar amount? I'm sure there's other things. If there are those other things, do you think that they at times will play to each other? So you will inherently, you're going to gain value this way versus gaining monetary. Or is it just
Yeah, I've seen things that conflict like that sometimes. Generally, what our guiding principles are is how's the project going to happen? Because in the end, you can have the best ideas in the world, if you can't prove it finance, it's not going to happen. And so, that's usually, if there's something that's at odds, that's usually what we go back to is, okay, what's the driving force behind the project? How's it actually get done? Is it a public approvals process that we really have to go through? Is it something else? I don't feel like I'm answering your question as directly as I could.
I just don't know if, given that you have a wide variety of clients, that in those situations, do you end up saying that even your values as a client are as it's like the workforce example, if you said here are 3 different models, you really want to recruit the best talent, you're going to put your office in this city versus this city, and even though it may be monetarily really beneficial. Right. That's what I'm just wondering, and maybe that all distills down to, yes, you are still in the right proposition. And there's a situation that you find it. I'm just wondering where are the cases where it's like, okay, there's multiple things that we're trying to tell. Well, if you really want to show in the negotiation, there's an underlying value. Maybe you didn't start off.
A lot of times there are conflicts like that. So you can resolve them in one instance, right? One is it's a very robust handholding process of getting buy-in from stakeholders, right? Which kind of gets us beyond modeling and things like that. It's more about management and management of the project process. And so sometimes that's the case, a lot of times that's the case. Other times it's about finding a decision framework that allows you to get there. And so, it starts to create certain types of priorities. So decision models are sort of things that we work on all the time. I'd say it never really gets to the point where it's we have to build an airplane or a submarine. Never quite that much in conflict. But I guess I see the point.
right. That's probably going to go out of the scope of the designer, but we have to work with the client to see how it all comes and kind of use those data that the result is, and to come back and calibrate the models.
Yeah, like just post on.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have now a lot of the ground up stuff since I've only been at Gensler for 2 years. It's been a previous project before Gensler. But we do that as often as we can. I think that's really essential.
The lifespan of like some of these programming pieces. So like this mixed use project, you said like the lifespan of like a retail space is going to be less like a student housing or something. Are you able to take that to account? Like, does that influence the way you like flex these parameters?
Yeah, you're talking about like your tenant improvement, refresh rates, things like that.
Yeah, like a retail space might be remodeled, way before housing does. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can account for any variables that you want. In fact, in hotels, for example, because it refreshes like every 7 years. Some of the first decisions, once a hotelier comes in, it's a new property, the first thing they start doing is their capital plan to keep setting the renovation. Because it's such an important piece of that actually keep it operational. Yeah, I mean, it depends on what exactly you can get very finite and very long term. Tenant improvement for things that are going to have a really high tenant improvement cost, you generally want to factor in. So in this project, it does. So I guess that answers your question. I mean, anything that's really going to move the needle on the equation, you want to account for. You don't as much want to get into the issues of it's $212 and $213 a square foot. You really just want to make sure you're not missing $50 chunks. Any ideas for like what stuff that we can answer a lot better in our field? Like a lot of ideas on that.
Where's the opportunity for intuition?
Yeah.
Like when your model tells you something that all the data is pointing to it, but you have an intuition, which is kind of drives designers, people like that to be like, well, I know this one's well strong, so I really think X. I think that it's like it's strong. I think that it could expand beyond this. Like, where do you tweak that, like in the model, or where do you love that model?
I don't think that's a model one. I think that's more of a design strategy. I've never found anything to this or whatever it is, right? I've never been in a circumstance where things are that clearly at odds. But you certainly have decision points. Frankly, that has to get resolved in a project process. You're never going to be able to develop a model that does everything for you. My perspective is, and this is why we deal with so many different frameworks and approaches and data sets. And analysis, good analysis in general, market analysis, doesn't have one answer. Right? It's more of a process of triangulation, corroboration. And so what we need to do is find sets of tools that allow for that kind of flexibility, whether that's intuition. I think I'm not sure I'd say it's intuition. Just there are other ways to think about the hierarchy. Wisdom is understanding where analysis can be response. And so if you put enough versions of the future that are all brought out on the table,
so how do you, one of the questions that comes up in design usually is what's your design budget? Like how much, we're going to have, real fancy granite and ultra sleek glass facade versus something that's more plain Jane.
Right.
And so how much money we get to spend on the finishes is usually something designers want to know.
Right.
What's their tool set? What's
their
kit parts to play games with?
Yeah, that's an interesting one because it's a high volume space. You're more or less looking for corporate.
Yeah, well, it could be corporate interiors. It could be the facade of you know, some high-end mixed-use buildings. Some buildings definitely go low budget route, and some buildings, which the location justifies higher end response.
So what we've done is build some tools around essentially that as an input that allow for different specifications across the different products that you might choose. So you can actually sit there and set a limit, and then you can start to choose the different permutations. But designers aren't sitting there coming up with something that you know think is about right. But they actually sit there and calculate. If I do this, that leaves me this much for something else, or I'm over by that much. That, so that you can start to work on a design thesis, at least guide it with some guardrails.
Right. So, you know, I mean, if you know those budgets, you can design for that going in, then you're maybe less likely to get value engineered while things being priced. Yeah. Sometimes it's just like hit or miss. You know, sometimes you luck out, the owner prices come back and wow, it came in budget and the owner can afford it. It gets built the way you drew it.
Right.
And then sometimes you go low, you spend, it's just way more expensive than what they wanted to spend. So that's, in that case, which one of these, is it in one of these lists here? That's
I
where
don't
it
think
gets.
that one made it in here. But yeah, we had built tools around that, too, especially because it does a lot of
Mhm.
She brings up for the value of your input. Yeah, it's a four-letter word, because that's what we respond. Because value engineering generally costs us.
Yeah.
So the value of what this exercise is doing is helping us to forward out value engineering. Is it true?
Yeah, I mean, we want to create as much alignment between how things are going to be implemented and how we're actually thinking about design. To the extent there are gaps in the process and knowledge, it's much less likely that what we're actually working on is something things are going to be really effective. So it's really trying to think about everything and do it to the tail in that process.
You know, in your case, do you did this sort of thing for all the Gensler offices, or did you primarily just focus here in Chicago?
We work across, so we're the only analysts. We work across the platform. Now we have folks in other offices.
So you're from what?
We try and work with our Chicago friends.
I don't know this. Do you think like after you do this kind of exercise over and over, you think you'll be able to kind of develop a knowledge base for the firm and for the team, and be able to use that knowledge base to kind of better convince the client as a designer, like your voice will carry more weight than sometimes you compete with engineers to value engineers, and use those kind of data might be able to, and also like maybe past experiences.
Well, and yeah, absolutely. I'd say more broadly in the industry. Particularly when you're talking about large capital requirements, you're talking about people who have to get approval for certain decisions that matter to the improvement. Right? And what in engineering and some realms of financial advisory, they've gotten to a point, not that they can prove it, but they've gotten to a point where they can essentially back up what they're saying much more than we can. And so we need much better at that because that enables us to do further out. And yeah, so as that knowledge develops, as those proof concepts develop, it becomes a lot easier to preserve and hopefully enhance our technical in the open environment with respect to all the other programs.
But you're digging into a database of empirical information that, that it can be actually more, can be as analytical. For instance, structure, typologies. You're able to provide, since the historical
Yeah, and actually a lot of the tools, because I come from background in economics and finance, and so when we came over to Gensler, a lot of the tools are basically the same tools. And so we're not actually at a disadvantage. We're looking at other advisors in that space in terms of the tools that we use, and which actually is an opportunity because what we can start to do, a lot of other folks they're focused on selling certain types of products. And our focus isn't on selling certain types of products that can actually your business model. It's on figuring out tools that exist that guide those types of processes, how to actually drive design processes. So it frees us up to actually apply information in different ways, particularly when we talk about financial information. It allows us to apply it in different ways than that. It's actually quite fun.
I guess this leads to the model where you're talking about, I guess, program efficiencies, where the areas of different programs you developed out. But do you have sort of a model or a buffer maybe for occupant comfort, or maybe, I guess the best example I could think of is in a residential area. If you have 4 lounges or something, it might not be the most efficient space cost-wise, but it can make your occupants more comfortable.
Yeah. I mean, that is a place where you see some tension when you're talking about how much to invest in that versus how much to invest in whole square footage. That's always a conversation. Because financial equation wants to push the minimum square footage and push the rental values as high as it can. But you have to be able to draw the line in certain conversations around it. But frankly, if a space like that makes or breaks the project, or not very project. If the margin for error is that small, it's a more complicated process when the entire thesis is something that's never been done before or proved, where the amenity is completely out of whack, but anything that comes in that market creates a huge burden on the financials of the project. You really have to prove that whatever that amenity is adds value somewhere else.
How often does, looking at the ground levels of the catchment area, how often does kind of the history of a company, its performance, is it you're working with one hotel over another, how much does that affect what its catchment area is? Like a casino will have bus routes to different areas, and also its catchment is huge, or something like that. Like how often does this hotel works? Is usually more popular than this hotel, and even though maybe you don't need a hotel in this area, it is successful.
There's a brand value in that, for sure.
Yeah.
And retail, flats, hotels, things like that. And so generally what you want to do is you want to take the company's existing information, and that will tell you what the catchment area is for that product. But yeah, you can't see all the areas, especially if you're talking about more local or regional operators versus national operators.
In your analysis, and you don't have to say one example, but have you found, or are you starting to see emerging trends just because you're able to use computation and analyze large sets of data and starting to see trends that maybe the profession isn't tackling yet that we can tackle later, but
right. Secret sauce.
Yeah, right.
We are seeing some things. Actually, I think most of the things that we're seeing are based on us going down these types of roads, right? These types of questions, where we're seeing the greatest opportunities to have that programs. Generally have to do with a lot of things like and particularly when you're looking at least. And so I think it's pretty well covered by this. Nothing else that we really aside from what I've already said, that's the brand conversation. I mean, one of the things about, so again, real estate's not a big business model. It's, high capital costs, high fixed costs, low rate of return, and get near, let's say 10%, right? And the reason why brand works so well, brand value works so well, and if you extend that a little further to media, is if you look at the profile and returns in media, it's actually kind of flip opposite of real estate, right? Relatively low costs, right? Relatively low fixed costs. High rates of return, and from an economic perspective, scalable, and increasing returns to scale, which is unusual. So if we make a movie or something like that, you show it one more, it doesn't cost you any more to show it to 1 million people, it doesn't want to. And so when you can integrate those things, this is why like sports media models and things like that are some of the best examples. And it's also the case why you're seeing combinations of, let's say, brand representation, hospitality, things like that. My guess is you'll start to see that expand to universities and hospitals a lot more at brand value. But when you can integrate some measure of brand value into that fixed cost of real estate, it's just value add. Right? So you can add a lot more rate of return by just adding a little bit of brand value. What's the example I use? So like LEDs, just to use a really simple example. One LED screen, depending on what place, but one LED screen in a reasonably high traffic area along the interstate, and that is much income year to year as 150,000 square foot regional shopping center or neighborhood shopping center. It's a little different, right? And so to the extent we can find, particularly in these, and this again, traffic optimization, things like that, particularly in these really high visibility environments, urban environments that work in a lot, if you can figure out how to squeeze some of that value out, it completely change the economics of what you can do with the money, what you can do with that extra.
I think it's interesting that you're not going to go into this background because that puts into question like the architectural firm and its components. Because right now, and I just joined it to do something like for a couple months. I don't know a lot of smaller components, but now I work that. This is super in depth. Like when you're doing a project and you're like doing almost like massive and like oh let's do something, you're kind of eyeballing like doing a little bit of investigation. This is our code requirements for like setbacks and heights, and you just kind of measure it out quickly. And this is like a way of giving the client the opportunity to kind of get the best out of what they're investing. And I'm just questioning now if like architecture firms should start looking at having other components like maybe economics being in there to kind of, expand that whole idea of,
So we have a bias against it, that, we need a new paradigm for our industry because we're being, commoditized into a box. So, that's part of the way we do that is by taking ownership for some of the things the client will do that.
The higher was.
I have a question. Yeah. So it seems like a lot of the tools you've created are like best suited for like feasibility and early phase sort of design. Do you have any plans to sort of, I guess, create tools for application in later phases of design or things that maybe like inform material choices and that type of thing? I mean, things that sort of, I guess, dovetail in with sort of energy models and just such other ways that we're, I guess, quantifying.
Yeah, I can't speak smart on that.
Well, from working with Wes, the thing that this group does, from a very a large big picture standpoint, what it really does is it enables decision making in a very confident way by the clients at a relatively early stage, which enables the project to develop much faster and hold to the decisions that we make. Whereas they're informed. So, but to your question, because I think I know where this is going, that's part of what we're investigating now is how to utilize that, because what that boils down to still is ROI. Right? So is a more expensive, higher performing protocol actually generating greater value based on a financial model that you can justify to a client to make the decision to go ahead with that investment because it enables. So I don't think it's there yet, but that's part of what we're trying to figure out between guys that use analysis models for design plan as opposed to financial.
Yeah, and there are a lot of different places to take it, but I think there's part of the reason for asking your comment and joining. Part of the reason I was excited to talk with you is I actually think this is a space that's great for innovation. That there's a ton of information that frankly I feel is pretty stale in terms of process innovation, and that we can certainly get there in a lot of different ways. So we can solve it all obviously not, but
No, I was just
certainly pushing on there. Yeah.
Well, that's exactly what we do right now. Is we're looking for ways that you can study that in real time by utilizing some sort of information graphic that is essentially a spreadsheet, but is digestible from a client standpoint, coupled with a dovetail with, say, radiation.
Right. Well, that'd be a really easy way to do it, I suppose. It's like, for instance, I mean, your project is an office tower in Guangzhou, and I mean, maybe not the best place for fluorescein glass, but I mean, things means we have sort of control now. And then, like, if you were to introduce external shading, like, you can quantify what the reduction of radiation would be on your fixed glass. And that's all great, but to the client, I guess, kilowatt hours per square meter doesn't really mean anything. But if you can give them a sort of number of what that would, how that would reduce sort of cooling load, that might be.
Or increase the
life
rent.
cycle costs.
If people do waste management systems. Because what
Is
I,
he saying it to me and not to me?
what seems logical to me is particularly the paradigm that you're in, and this element seems to be a logical component of that process.
You're asking what the secret is to, like, what? I mean, we've had many conversations about how would you actually use the type of data that Wes can tap into. Because as you pointed out, I mean, there's the forecasting doesn't exist without behavioral models and precedents. Right? So some of the work that we do is trying to figure out how we can leverage the tools and processes we already use, but use the data that he has access to as the input parameters, as opposed to FAR or setback or environmental analysis. How can you use that exact same Plato factor but put it in a different type of
And usually there's
or mixing it together?
maybe there's voice cycle costs or something else. There are other disciplines that are really important to the conversation. And behavioral science could be any number of other things, but we want to include anything that gets us to the place that the project process.
I mean, there's something that kind of is my discussion to talk about that is very present is the idea of environmental design and how that's used. Like the practice. We talk about that in school, but we always struggle where to find those graphics, and you can really talk about how those graphics where did they come from.
Yeah, certainly folks like myself can provide some parameters. There are other people who provide great parameters too who live in other disciplines. And I think part of what's interesting is that design firms have started to kind of incubate the capability of that kind of integration. But the other disciplines that are really important actually get into that integrated process that we generally don't have in design. And so when something goes over the wall into another firm, even though some firms are much more collaborative than others, let's say energy engineering, right? When something goes over the wall, it's a lot harder to figure out how to integrate it into your project process.
I think
consultants in general, it becomes a process of, here we are at, you know, a milestone deadline. Toss your model over to them, they analyze it, and by the time you get it back, you know, you've already changed the design so much that maybe you need to analyze it sort of.
You're in a position to say, look, confirm our suspicions, or you're like to dismiss your conclusions because you've already moved beyond that, right? As opposed to actually using that as a driver of the decisions at the inception.
So I mean that's a lot of why this group exists and why we're trying to build up these presentations that the guys like Wes providing this financial data. I think did Mustafa do one? Yeah. Right, on energy modeling and actually being able to do all of this in-house, or at least know someone who does, where you don't have to export your model to somebody else. You bring that information into the firm and start to use that, you know, as design elements, not just does this work, yes or no, kind of things that you can actually problem solve really.
Well, that's, I think, the part of this like process, innovation, discussion, breaking down the silo, the feedback loop between these different disciplines. Fast enough, so we're able to that's right. I think that's a really great presentation of something that, you know, we've seen a lot of like building parametric design presentation. This is like a great story of how really on the client side of it is how we use professionally to our processes to create value. It really is remarkable here and almost relief in the client space when you can arm that with non-subjective criteria to make a decision that would otherwise be highly subjective. And I'm trying to convince you of the validity of this as opposed to I'm presenting you with the validity of this. It's not a personal decision, which is why the decisions generally stick, which expedites pretty much the entire process. Which really, it's kind of amazing.
And it creates a lot more space for design to actually happen, right? Because design is expensive in that process, and establish the parameters, and then, you know, create space for it.
Do you work also with the consumers at the same time? For example, when you're creating a scheme, do you actual resident have to receive 5, 10, 20 years, this is
Try and go out as far as you can. The reality of the business science and economics is that, you know, anything beyond like 10 years is like the equivalent of peak time physics, like 500 billion years, who knows? And so, which is why this notion of hyper flexibility is really important. Like, it's relatively predictable what's going to happen in the next 5 years. You know, less so, but still somewhat so. 10 years. Beyond that, you're starting to get into this fuzzier territory, which is why most financial models are based on such a short time model. And it's why the notion of hyper flexibility is really important. So if we can design, hyper flexibility is a really important economic premise and a really important design premise. You can get them together in some ways. Because it allows you some assumptions that, or it allows you flexibility of achieving something that you can't currently perceive. And you know, if you can design things like that, it's really changes the economic model. So yeah, we try and do it, but you know, if you came to you saying I don't know exactly what's going to happen. Thanks for that. Yeah, thank you. Actually,
We present it. We raise an action. Huh?